Hello and welcome back to another episode of Alpha Studies. Once again, I am your host, Dr. Eden Curtis. Today we have yet another special episode for you all. In fact, for the next couple of episodes, we will be briefly discussing biology. Since starting the show, I've received letters and emails from you all curious about many different things. Topics such as, how does an alpha woman's body work? What are their pheromones like? And can alpha women get pregnant? However, due to my education being limited to historical and sociological topics, I thought it would be only fitting to bring in a good friend of mine, Dr. Brooklyn Carrington.
Please call me Brooks. Hearing the name Brooklyn makes me think my mother is speaking to me.
Yes, well, I've been told I have an authoritative voice,
Which I'm sure helps the lines of young students you have on the waiting lists for your classes.
Brooklyn.
Yes, Mother?
You think you're clever, don't you?
Well, the awards and degrees certainly help.
Dr. Carrington is a certified OBGYN in the alpha, omega, and beta reproductive systems. So I thought bringing her onto the show for your more biological-based questions was fitting.
I have specialties in male omega gynecology. It's actually quite difficult for young omegas assigned male at birth to receive proper reproductive health care, as most of the industry focuses on omega and beta female reproductive systems. But I do also have a subspecialty in alpha female gynecology. It's actually quite fascinating how similar the structures of the systems are to each other. Most professionals in the field agree the only real feasible difference is the focus of the reproductive systems.
Oh wow. We're just off to the races, aren't we?
You asked me to come on here and talk about how alpha women's reproductive systems work. I'm not going to waste any time. It's too big of a topic to beat around the bush about.
I see, then by all means take it away, Dr. Carrington.
With pleasure. Gynecological studies for any dynamic have some highly negative roots. Marion Sims, or Rat Bastard as I call him, is largely considered the father of gynecology. This son of a bitch experimented on enslaved persons and built his medical career off of literal bodies of other human beings. He became the president of the Medical Association in the States and then the Gynecological Society. I suppose those roots are still reflective of how patients are treated today. Even today, there are doctors running around carrying on the tradition of not providing painkillers for their patients, having the audacity to say that it doesn't hurt.
Am I right to assume those so-called doctors are usually alpha or beta men?
Statistically, you'd be correct, but based on stories I've heard from my patients, it's everyone. According to my patients, I'm one of the few doctors who take extra care to ensure my patients are as comfortable as possible. 5 out of every 6 alpha women have had negative experiences in the OBGYN office. It's an epidemic that many alpha women don't go to their OBGYNs even when issues arise. In growing numbers, alpha women are experiencing loss of life due to preventable reproductive illness or even cancer that could have been treated. For alpha women in particular, they've had the most difficulties receiving proper reproductive health care, historically speaking, despite Marion Sims having actively experimented on several enslaved alpha women. Disgustingly enough, he was quoted as saying that they were some of his favorites to experiment on because they lasted longer and didn't scream as much.
This is a surprisingly heavy topic.
Yes, but it's important. I want our listeners to understand the roots of this practice. I don't want to whitewash or sugarcoat any of it. Also, if my will has any power in the universe, I will actively wish ill on Marion Sims's afterlife every time I get the chance. If there is a God and a hell, I hope Marion Sims is burning with a speculum up his ass.
You're clearly very passionate about this subject.
You knew who I was when inviting me on. I may have gentle hands, but I curse like a sailor. I just hope you don't have any sponsors for this show.
Don't worry about that, Brooks. Please continue.
You don't need to tell me twice. First, let's break down how alpha women's reproductive cycles work. Before I get into that, I want to come out and say firstly that these standards have roots based in prejudice and bias as much medical science in the States does. So please take these so-called standards with a grain of salt. When alpha girls are born, very seldom is there any visible difference in their anatomy. Just as any other dynamic, the structures determining what they will present as will not fully mature until puberty. The only exception to being able to possibly tell even at birth what a child's dynamic might be is with omega male infants. Just like with women, omega males are born with all the ovum that they will produce. Of course, as with anything in biology, this is not a binary situation. There are many documented cases of young men being born with ovum cells that did not develop into omega men. This can be because of a multitude of reasons, but one of the most common is that they are interdynamic or intersexed.
If I may interject for just a moment.
Don't let me stop you.
Dear listeners, you may remember me mentioning in the first episode that the lines between dynamics can blur or intersect. Interdynamic individuals are such individuals I was speaking about. These individuals will often have physical traits that belong to other dynamics. For example, an omega that has bulbing glands on their genitals. Or an alpha that may have glands in their anal canal that secrete fluids. Or similar things can happen to betas, where they could have both bulbing glands or glands in their anal canal.
Yes, but most of those examples refer to assigned male at-birth persons. When discussing assigned female at-birth persons, things get a bit more tricky. What we typically see in interdynamic women is more internal. They may end up with ovary systems that look closer to alpha women. In an alpha woman's biology, there are two key differences on the cell level. More reproductive cells are produced, and they often have tails on the end of them, making them look similar to male reproductive cells of other dynamics. Conversely, the opposite is true for omega men. Fewer cells are produced, and they have no tails, making them look closer to female reproductive cells of other dynamics. Interdynamic women will often experience issues with conception if they are interdynamic with alpha traits. This is because the cells will not stick to the walls of their uterine lining easily. Alpha women's reproductive cells, in layman's terms, are built for travel. Implantation inside is incredibly difficult. It's a 1 in 100 chance. So that's about 10 for every 1,000 cells. This isn't to say that all couples who are experiencing conception issues are couples that have an interdynamic person in them. But that being interdynamic can cause issues that affect the lives of the persons who have such a condition. Interdynamic omega men and women often need assistance in creating fluids because they lack the proper glands to do so. Interdynamic alpha women will often experience estrus that is closer to going through heat rather than rut. But anyway, I feel like we've gone off track.
That's quite all right, it happens often on the show. You were speaking on how alpha women develop.
Right, yes. Thank you, Eden. So as I was saying before that sidebar, when alpha women reach puberty, they, like many other dynamics, will present for the first time. Depending on genetics or ethnicity, that can look differently in alpha women. Many young alphas assigned female at birth will have similar genital construction to male-presenting individuals, while others may have what they call in the Stone Kingdom ein versteckt Klinge, which translates to a hidden blade. I'm sure with that sort of language it's easy to imagine what that means in real life.
Yes, the phrase serves as a clear descriptor. Nevertheless, that sort of condition was historically considered desirable amongst alpha women because it helped them pass as other dynamics. Throughout much of the Western world's history, due to the influence of the church and patriarchy, alpha women have been persecuted or discriminated against. So having the ability to pass as another dynamic ensured survival.
Exactly, but sadly that also led to the belief of alpha women being spirits that replaced viable daughters. The development was often seen as sudden and startling. Many alpha women lost their lives due to this, despite it being a natural part of our biology. Even today, the prejudice still survives in one form or another. In the medical field, there are doctors that believe that alpha women are not quote-unquote real women. On top of that, alpha women, especially those of minority backgrounds, are often given fewer pain medications during general surgery. Speaking in terms of medical care, alpha women often face nothing but pain when walking through the doors of a hospital. This is one of the many contributing factors to the continued lower life expectancy of alpha women. The current average life expectancy in the States is 79 years old. However, for alpha women that drops to 75 years old, for alpha women of minority that drops further down to 73.
I'm sure it continues to drop with every instance of intersectionality as well.
Yes. Please don't get me started on the difficulties that alpha women face while also having disabilities. We'd be here all day if you did.
Perhaps that can be a topic for another day.
You'd have to rent out this studio space for several days if you did, Eden.
I certainly would not mind that in the least. Providing space for spreading awareness is one of the reasons why I wanted to start this show in the first place. There are a lot of misconceptions about alpha women, and we've been quite the insular group for some time. I'm hoping that providing just a little bit of education like this will help the life of at least one little alpha girl out there. Or at the very least make it a little easier.
I hope so too. Getting back to the topic of reproductive cycles, alpha women tend to go through 2 stages of their cycle each month. For a few days, they will go into a rut like any other alpha. This comes with the much more usual symptoms: high sexual appetites, irritability, and territorial behavior. Anyone who has a partner who is an alpha knows how this can be. But after that, what happens is what makes alpha women's reproductive cycles so unique. If they have a partner that is able to assist them through the first few days of their rut, it will stop as it usually does for any other alpha. If they don't, they enter into the second stage of estrus, which looks more like menstruation for beta or omega women. Out of every other dynamic, many doctors agree that biologically, alpha women's reproductive systems are the most encouraging of reproduction. I suppose this is why biology and sociology call them city builders.
Oh? Did you listen to the first episode, Brooks?
Let's just say I enjoy hearing that authoritative voice of yours.
Something you and my students have in common, I suppose.
For those of you listening, I'm not sure if you all are aware of exactly how popular this lady is on the DCU campus. She's got the face of Estelle Franklin, and almost every single freshman falls head over heels for her. We can never get lunch on campus because at least 3 students will come to our table just to talk to her.
Again with this Estelle business. I don't see the resemblance.
Well, Casey and I do, and I'm telling you she has to be like your grandma or something.
I'm not going to argue with you about this again. Let's just continue on with the topic, please.
All right. So as I was saying, alpha women have 2 stages for their rut cycle. Usually, or at least statistically, it will last about 6 days. Shorter or longer, depending on a multitude of variables, but that's the average. Ideally, ruts should be mostly painless with some discomfort. If you're experiencing painful ruts, you may want to speak with your doctor. Just be ready to advocate for yourself in the office, because not all doctors will be willing to test for issues. Now, you mentioned at the top of the episode that one of the questions was, can alpha women get pregnant?
Yes, that is one of the many questions I've received since starting this show.
Gotcha. Well, not to sound crass.
That'll be a first.
Haha. Not to sound crass, but anyone with the equipment can get pregnant if there are no other issues. This includes alpha women. It should be noted, historically, alpha women have ended up with other alpha women more often than not. For example, my great-grandmothers were both alpha women.
Yes, across the world, especially in Western countries and societies, alpha women have a long sapphic history. There are many documented cases within the church where alpha women have been bound to each other. Though on paper it was called sister-making rather than marriage. Those sorts of relationships weren't always sexual in nature, and it's said that those relationships were comprised of the ideals of Urs, Storg, Agape, and Philia. The bond was believed to be, in fact, much deeper than the bond of marriage within the church. But it was pretty much accepted that sexual expressions of that bond were a natural result. So any children that came from such unions grew up within the church, and were considered to be sent from the Creator, with a divine purpose to serve on the mortal plane. Of course, these sorts of unions led to the creation of a subculture for alpha women. The church, while often being a source of persecution, served as a network for alpha women. Because of the church, alpha women created what we call today the sisterhood. If you have a loved one, or a friend, or perhaps are an alpha woman yourself, you may have heard or been called sister by another alpha woman. This is a signal to communicate that they are a safe person, as it's considered by the sisterhood wrong to allow another alpha woman to be harmed in their presence. This culture of protection developed due to the dangers that young women faced within and outside of the church. This sort of subculture has been a steady tradition carried on by alpha women even today. It should be noted that it's considered offensive for a person who does not identify as an alpha woman to call an alpha woman they are not related to by a blood sister. So for those of you thinking that using such a phrase would be a great show of solidarity, please reconsider.
Are you going to have an episode about the tenants?
I am considering my options on that. I'd like to get a few more opinions about discussing those before allowing others to hear them.
I understand, it still feels wrong to talk about that sort of stuff.
Indeed it does. Like you, I have grandmothers that were alpha women as well. So I was taught about the sisterhood from a very young age. It's an extremely important safety net that we have created amongst ourselves to catch us where society has failed. As much as I'd like to continue our conversation, Brooks, it seems we've run out of time for this episode. I would like to thank you all for listening. We'll continue our conversation with Brooks in the next episode. In the meantime, if you have any other questions, please be sure to comment below.